I'm really pleased to announce the two people who will be taking this next spot, speaking for about 30 minutes. First is Professor Barry Judd, who is the Director of Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. He was awarded his PhD by Monash in 2007. His thesis, Australian Game, Australian Identity, Post-Colonial Identity in Football, explored formations of identity in the sport of Australian rules football. He's joined by Yaluk-ut Carolyn Briggs, a Boon Wurrung senior elder and chairperson and founder of the Boon Wurrung Foundation, a descendant of the First Peoples of Melbourne, the Yaluk-ut Weelam clan of Boon Wurrung. She is a great-granddaughter of Louisa Briggs, a Boon Wurrung woman born near Melbourne in the 1830s. Carolyn has been involved in developing and supporting opportunities for Indigenous youth and Boon Wurrung culture for over 40 years. In 2005, she established the Boon Wurrung Foundation, which has been responsible for significant work in cultural research, including restoration of the Boon Wurrung language. The foundation also helps connect Aboriginal youth to their heritage. So I'm really excited to hand over to Barry and Yaluk-ut Carolyn for this next talk.
Michael, it's a real honour and a pleasure to be invited here today to interview Aunty Carolyn Briggs.
Ruth.
Many people will know Aunty Carolyn as a Boon Wurrung elder, but she's actually here today to speak to us as a fellow researcher, fellow PhD graduate, and an elder within the Victorian higher education system. One thing that I really admire about Aunty Carolyn is her dedication over many decades to the support of Indigenous people in higher education. And I know that over those decades, she has done much work behind the scenes in just about every university there is in this state, and has a history of working in the sector that goes back to the 1970s to Monash University, where I graduated with my PhD. So Aunty Carolyn is a significant figure in terms of the history of Indigenous higher education, and she's here today to help celebrate that fact. Recently, she gained her own PhD from RMIT University, and this session today between the two of us is a Q&A session. It's very informal. It's not a formal paper session like many of the other presentations might have been. So I'm going to simply run it as if it's a chat between two people who have known each other for a couple of decades now and both have PhDs and who are both highly committed to Indigenous research and Indigenous student support activities within higher education. So, Aunty Carolyn, you describe your study broadly as defining my role as an elder and how the transmission of that knowledge to urban youth demands all resources available. This included mapping, recordings, documentation and language. This also involved having a certain understanding of country and defining society and what belonging means. So my first question for you is, why did you choose that particular topic, and what kind of conclusions or recommendations or findings emerged from your PhD studies?
Well, it was a big challenge when I think about it, because I didn't believe at that stage I had enough references, because I was entering into doing my master's at Swinburne. I started off talking about doing a master's when I presentation at Melbourne Uni, but somehow I got a position over at Swinburne, and that's where the opportunity came about. When I was looking at the knowledge base that I'd built over the years, as you stated, it was about art and design, and it was design anthropology, and they wanted me to lecture in it, but they were also preparing me to do my master's as well. So I presented my first to the committee, and they stated that this was more than a master's, this was a PhD, which threw me into another, oh my goodness, I just wanted to know how to do a master's, you know. Now I have to do something that is relevant for what I needed to do, and that was the importance of identifying and recognising elders' knowledges. So that's what led, because people tend to call you auntie and giving you that status, but it's more than a role as the word auntie and what auntie represents. And I remember the early public servants used to say, oh, when we're old, we call our old people auntie. But auntie brings a lot of responsibilities, and I think that's what I needed to address. What were those responsibilities when you're providing information back to your communities, or you're recognised in the community as an elder, and what is an elder? And what is the responsibility of an elder? And who I could only model myself on was looking at old knowledge or old documents, looking at remembering my own stories, because when you grow up, you never question. You never question about who you were, how you belonged. You just knew families, you know, and you just remember meeting people and they'd be calling my mother auntie, and I've gone, oh, there must be more relatives, in my naive sense of my early years. And but it became, when my mother passed in 1970, the need to know what it meant to be for Indigenous, Aboriginal, Koori, whatever label they were putting on us. And that was, and I think working with Professor Colin Burke, it was sort of, he came in that period of time. It's, well, what did it mean being an Aboriginal? What did it mean? I just thought I was a kid growing up in a system that you knew there was boundaries, but you didn't understand what those boundaries meant till because of 67 referendum. And my old people had lived under that. I didn't realise I lived under those two acts. So I had to look back at those two acts that I lived under, the protection acts. And that was a bit of a rude awakening. And then it was another awakening that Aboriginal people could be in institutions like Monash. And listening to the speakers of that time, who were the early activists, it sort of made me aware of what was going on in this continent, and how we were marginalised. And then I had to understand why we were marginalised. I knew we had to obey rules, and I thought that was for everybody, but it was for a particular group like ourselves. So that was something I needed to research, look at, understand the people what were presenting papers or talking about constitutions. My world certainly woke up to a lot of information that I was quite naive about, but I was because I was very protected in a way that my mum obeyed the rules, that we were assimilating into a system that was very relevant for us at that stage, relevant for her not to lose her children. It was relevant for her to make sure that I had some knowledge, and I always grew up around my family. We went from Naya West to Moolaman to Moe. So my father got work. So there was a mobilisation of a lot of Indigenous people that was for work, but they all had a connection with my mum. So it was something. And then the rude awakening came when they started labelling me, and I couldn't understand that. And I thought, well, I'm not a black fella, because I had a different image of what a black fella was. So I thought, oh, the people that were calling my mother were black fellas. And I thought, well, they're just like my relatives. So it was all this conflict and confusion and growing up, and then having to challenge that. And PhD did that. But my working and seeing how people were being marginalised soon awakened a lot of impact, even not having a good education at that stage, working in factories, being abused, being called names, soon toughened me up, and always looking for that avenue out, because my mother used to say, white people, their learning is in books. Ours was about storytelling. So if you want to be as good as your white counterpart, you have to go and keep building your educational needs in the Western system. So it took me a long time, and then I had the opportunity working with Colin Burke and Reg Blow at that stage, and in between that I did mothercraft and childcare in the evening, and that gave me more skills of working and understanding children's development. So it was all of those processes, and then realising a lot of our community members, the lack of educational skill, Western educational skills, but they had other knowledges. And the knowledges that reminded me of that was when we could connect with each other. So when I was working in Dandenong, I could connect with family groups who had moved down from Deniliquin, who was from my grandmother's side. So it was always that reaffirming who I was, how I fitted, the strength of my family's knowledge, the kinship or the relationship with each other was very important to keep building that relationship or that assets of knowledge, and realising those opportunities could be afforded to me. And I took them, and then they set up neighbourhood houses where you could do studies. I tried to go back to high school, realised I'd missed a chunk of my learning. So going into a neighbourhood house, learning to write, because I dropped out in year 8. And so that's where it was. And that's why opportunities of building skills, listening to other Indigenous people who had gone through those processes. So mine was about listening, learning, being observant in and around communities. So it was a different way of learning, but it was an Indigenous way of learning. The old people give you skills was the way of understanding the way I transitioned through the bush, how I transitioned about food, the importance of language, how we started to borrow other cultures' languages so that we had a point of difference to identify ourselves as black fellows that could speak a language, or how we coded, how we learnt to code, to keep demonstrating that point of difference. So that led me on. And when I thought I could do a master's, because I'm teaching master's students, I could do this. And then I started writing it all up, and then they said, no, do a PhD. It just threw me back into another spin, like I said before. So the hard work is that I collected a lot of information, stories, old people validating their knowledge that they were sharing with me, and remapping the stories of my ancestors, how they were taken to Tasmania, not Tasmania as such, to an island just off Preservation Island, Gun Carriage Island, and how they came back, how she had a husband who was Tasmanian, and going over there, trying to track those people down in the 60s, but they weren't there. So I didn't realise they were on other islands. What was it? They were on Flinders Island and Cape Barren. So when I went to Tassie, there wasn't many people who had identified as such. And then I met up with, he was a lecturer at Tasmanian University. I think he became the grandfather of permaculture. And I used to talk to him a lot about his research. And I said, some of this information is a bit wrong. And he said, yes, a lot of the people didn't know who they were or their heritage of who they were because of the sealing and whaling industry. So that was Professor Bill Mollison. Then I went and seen the guy what does phenology. And I thought, I wonder how he measures me in the skull. So it was always this wondering and not knowing how to ask the question. So a lot of that was because I've been conditioned not to ask questions. You just observe, see how the learning process is. And then it was about, when I was doing that PhD, it was a lot of drawing on a lot of knowledges from my cousins who are in their 90s, they're 96. They had memories that passed that I didn't have. My brother had memories, but I wasn't quite there at that stage for him to give me. He gave it to my son, not me.
Honey Carolyn, can I be very rude and ask a question at this point in time?
Yes, so I'd like you to, because I'll end up getting off the track.
I think you're describing key differences between what we've come to know as Indigenous knowledges and the way that Western knowledge operates through institutions like universities. And you came to complete your PhD in your 70s, build on a lifetime of learning and experience of the type you've just described to us. Can I ask a question about the methodological problems or the institutional problems that you may have encountered as somebody who wanted to do a PhD based on that lifetime of learning in your own community and outside of the institutional context? What kind of pitfalls, I guess, or problematic situations perhaps did you face in being someone with elder status coming into a university in midlife to complete this qualification?
So when I was looking at that, I had spoken to another Indigenous person who said, you're putting a lot of stress on yourself. Maybe you need to be looking at doing your PhD in understanding, writing down what you were doing. And it was Peters, young Peters, who works out at Swinburne. And because I knew all his family. So he was saying, look at the way you're telling your story, because it's oral tradition. So you're working from the premise of developing a structure in oral tradition, but you have to frame it into a Western paradigm to keep your boundaries moving. So the methodology was the big challenge for me. How do I put something that is transitioning from an oral to a Western model? And I had, where I was working with Dory Tunstall, understood that because she was filling my head about the early writers, black writers in America. So I was getting all of that scaffolding of that knowledge and thought, well, how could I tell the story? So it was telling a story about my journey as growing up in a very strong family. My napa kept us together on his property. So I had to retrace a lot of the memories that my mother, but there was a lot of genealogical stuff that she gave me, but also stories that she filled my head with. And differently that I couldn't expose her, but I just thought it was normal that family and parents give you stories, but it wasn't the same as what I'd be learning in school, because we were seen as the objects of the other. And listening to Maori people, thinking about how they told their stories from an oral tradition. So I was very fortunate to have a moment of a time with Linda Tuaway Smith, and then Dory Tunstall, and then she left to go to America or Canada, and then I got Olivia. So it was a challenge for Olivia, and I just kept writing. I just kept writing and helping me frame it in a way that staging it. So that's how that methodological, I challenged it. I challenged the academic structure, but I was able to, it was able to fit the academic framework somehow through her helping me sculpture it into a model, talking with others, talking to other relatives, and making sure I was on the same track. So for me, it was a big challenge, and I think they didn't know how to question me on it, even though I put a lot of evidence into it of what old records I could match it up with, because when you're setting the model, you had nothing to model it unless I looked at whoever done oral traditions, and I couldn't find anybody who had done that. So I just kept moving through sculpture. I was scaffolding my process into a way that there was a lot of reflections and memories, and how do you impact in that memory space of my life, and how policies had guided me, looking at policy and what influenced the way I operated within my system, or my family system, how I operated in Indigenous knowledge systems, validating the people who had scaffolded my learning process by stories, always stories. Everything was about stories of place, how I felt I was able to fit into place, how I fit into the role of an elder. I was recognised as an elder. And then I thought, how do I transition that knowledge using... I had to look at ways I could share that knowledge. And the way I could share that knowledge is through storytelling, creating stories, the rigours of those stories, and doing some background information so it made sense to the listener, getting people to have that experiential ways of knowing, or that epistemology of the two ways of knowing, and getting people to understand that that is what makes who you are and that consciousness that you bring. So I was always rigorous about the consciousness of what I was sharing and being conscious of that. But it was also validating the people who had been a part of my life and my growing years. So
thank you, Auntie Carolyn. We're running out of time, and I just want to prompt you with one final question, perhaps, and that is, as a result of your PhD, were you able to come up with something concrete about what it means to be an elder in an urban environment, and perhaps what Indigenous youth in an urban environment like Melbourne require from someone like you?
Well, you challenge yourself on that thing about the outcome of that research was to, well, it's inherited. You're scaffolded through your years to take on that role and responsibility. You don't realise it at this time. And then it was validated by your community, because I realised a lot of the community members, when I was put through the rigour of 3 judges questioning me about my heritage and my identity, and them validating that information, however they do it, that 3 judges, 3 white judges, having to examine your existence or your background, that validated that you were recognised as the holder of knowledge. So I would say I was a holder of the knowledge, and what constituted that holding of that knowledge. So it is that thing of epistemologies, of understanding how you fit within your society. So it is what I think anthropologists would put it up, what is the polity of what makes your society, but also the nodal of that you have continued to express your knowledge through the continuance of what makes your society in your family structure of identity, I believe. I'm just coming to terms with a lot of that information because it's another discipline like anthropology, but it's about the history, my own history. It's about the rigour that you have to understand where you fit in the society and the content of what scaffolds your learning process. So using modern technology is a way that I understood how I could share it in the way young people learn today. But I was very fortunate to have a lot of people invest in me that scaffold my process in the learning of Indigenous knowledges and validating that knowledge, because it's my knowledge. It's what makes me who I am, and what a lot of people, our old people, had invested that part of that knowledge into me as well. So I'm speaking on lots of people's voices, but my own impact that they contributed to that process as well, whether it be in food, whether it be in language, whether it be in just being a part of something that is a pretty amazing human being about this, the people that have been present in this landscape through their transmitting of knowledges. So I was looking at different ways I could transmit that knowledge through storytelling, through producing books, through new mediums like augmented realities or things which I love learning through, design with which I'm loving too as well. So I'm working with architectural design students, getting them to revision the landscape. Everything's been a whole learning for me. So it's a reciprocity. It's about a reciprocity. And it's what I've been given, what I want to give back to the next generation. We'll may carry it forward to build who they are, because it just doesn't come along. You just can't construct this person. The person is built from so many other things that went before them.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. And unless I'm mistaken, I think we are 3 minutes over time. We were allocated half an hour. So I really thank you, Aunty Carolyn, for coming along today and to speaking about these issues. I know that they're issues that are central to the Indigenous Knowledges Institute at the University of Melbourne, working through these issues of where Indigenous knowledge might fit in an institution like ours is the reason why the Institute was established in the first place. So thank you again for taking some time out of your day to join us.
Thank you, Barry, and I hope that helps somewhere, because it's not in an academic framework. It was very much about my life and understanding how I played out in this world that we play in now. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, but there's a lot of people, older people like me, that we can unpack and bring them forward, because I think it's very important, because you will lose that unless there's academics out there writing about us, but really don't have the sense of what it's about to have that lived experience. Thank you. And thank you to all the audience out there in the International Day that is about Indigenous knowledges. Thank you. Nongudjan.
Thanks so much, Aunty Carolyn. That was amazing. And Barry for providing the questions. Yeah, I think you're right. If there's something that we could maybe call as a universality in Indigenous knowledge, is that it's negotiated in place in a reciprocal manner. So I think that, you know, thank you very much for your deeply personal story, and I think that's exactly what we are trying to do, Barry, and what I'm really glad for the contribution to this day. Thank you very much.